Hello followers, Vidith22 here. If you have a scary story you'd like to feature on the channel, send it in at vidith22stories@gmail.com. Link in description. Now, on to the video. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood, in a town that was surrounded by forest. My childhood home was much like any normal kid's childhood home, but it was anything but normal. We had a white picket fence that gated our 2-story home. It was plain and simple, like many others. The backyard was at the edge of the forest, and from a young age, I would spend a lot of time with my father and brother in the forest. We would often go hunting and fishing in the forest, or have a campfire and roast marshmallows and wieners. We spent countless hours among the trees escaping from reality and technology, but I was always told to never adventure into the forest alone. One fall afternoon, my brother and I had been playing in our backyard. My father was always on a business trip and Mom was always at work. My brother was old enough to take care of me now, so afternoons after school we would come home and he would watch me until our mom came home. That afternoon, though, was different than other afternoons. As I said before, we were playing in the backyard, just throwing the baseball back and forth to each other. I can remember we were having a casual conversation, typical brother stuff, when my brother said something that really pissed me off. Thinking back now, I can't remember what he said that made me so upset. When I went to throw the ball back towards him, I threw it with force, and it struck him in the face. He raised his hand to his forehead and started to mutter curse words under his breath. When the initial shock of the surprise hit to the face wore off, he became angry at me and started to charge in my direction. It was an accident, but that didn't matter. I was still going to pay for the consequences. I turned around and started to run in the opposite direction of my now angry brother. I headed towards the forest and bolted towards it as fast as my 2 little feet could carry me. As I got to the edge of the lawn, I didn't hesitate, even though I could hear my father's voice in my head, saying, "Don't ever adventure into the forest alone." At that moment, it didn't matter, because I was hell-bent on making sure I escaped my brother. As I took my first solo steps into the forest, I looked over my shoulder while still running to see that my brother was still right behind me. He didn't stop at the boundary either, so at least we didn't break Dad's cardinal rule of going in the forest alone, even though deep down, I knew that meant without him. I continued running among the trees, and I could hear the sound of the dead fall leaves crunching under the weight of my feet. At that moment, even with my brother chasing me, I couldn't help but admire all the oranges, reds, and yellows in the trees. I loved the fall, and it was my favorite season. Fall air bared a scent unlike any of the other seasons, and as I ran from my brother, I drew every breath deep. I looked over my shoulder once more and realized that my brother was no longer chasing me. Maybe he turned around now, over the smack to the face from the ball. Just to make sure, I ran a few more feet, until I was content that he wasn't there. I stopped in a clearing, and stood still and listened. I couldn't hear anything though, over the sound of my own heart beating rapidly in my chest from all the running. As I started to regain my breath, and the beating in my chest went back to normal, I listened again. All I could hear was the running water of the nearby stream that we often fished in, and I could hear some woodpeckers off in the distance, but I couldn't hear my brother. As I started to look around, the forest that I had spent countless hours before started to look strange to me. While I was too busy running away, I didn't pay heed in my surroundings, and I was, without a doubt, lost. I began to shout out to my brother, but there came no response. I started to believe that this was his payback for hitting him in the face with the ball, but as I started to scream his name more, I realized that even he wasn't cruel enough to let his little brother panic in the middle of the woods alone. When I realized that he didn't hear me, I started to head back, in the direction I came from. At least I hoped it was the direction I came from, because after all the running, I lost my bearings and I didn't know up from down or left from right. As I was walking back, I heard something nearby. It sounded like a few branches snapping. I listened and expected to see a deer come out of the brush, but nothing could be seen. As I stood frozen, I listened again, and I could tell that the sound was heading in my direction and coming fast. I knew this wasn't my brother or a deer, and then worry started to set in when the thought crossed my mind that there are bears living in these woods. So once again, I started running aimlessly into the forest, going deeper and getting myself more lost. The sound of the stream was getting closer, so I knew if I followed it down, I would come on to the main road in our town. I would still be a few kilometers from home, but at least I'd be away from the bear that is pursuing me. I remained running towards safety, but I could still hear the bear behind me, charging full speed, with branches cracking off around it as it drew closer to me. I was too afraid to look over my shoulder, but I was also too nervous not to. As I glanced over my shoulder, I could see something, but it wasn't a bear. Just as I turned my head to look back ahead, the ground fell out from underneath me. I was in trouble now. When I finally reached the bottom, I landed on my stomach, knocking every bit of air out of my lungs. I tried hard to catch my breath, but the pain hurt so much that I couldn't. I rolled over onto my back and remained there until I was able to breathe again. I rolled back over to my hands and knees and felt a faint stinging pain shoot through my hands. When I turned them over and studied them, I noticed blood on both of my palms. I must have cut them while running through the trees. I'd fallen through an old root cellar that the local natives used to use during hunting season to store their catches until they returned home. They were abandoned now, though, and haven't been used in years. Cobwebs had filled the place, covering my face as I tried to move around and find a way out. The hole above that I had fallen through was too high for me to climb out now. Then I heard it again, branches nearby cracking off. I backed into the corner of the root cellar, away from the opening and into the shadows in hopes that whatever was up there didn't see me. I could hear it as it drew closer to the hole, its footsteps loud and heavy on the ground, almost like an elephant. I stayed in the shadows, trying to hold my breath so that it couldn't hear me, and I hoped that the dirt I was now covered in was enough to shield my scent from its nose. Suddenly, it was there, at the edge of the hole where I had fallen through. It stood on two legs, and it was undeniably tall as a giant. It had ash-colored skin, with its skeleton pushing through its flesh. The creature's head had very little flesh, and mostly bone-like horns sticking out. It had pointed ears, as you would see on an animal. As I remained in the shadows, I swear I could see its eyes glowing brightly as it gazed into the hole, sniffing. I wasn't sure if it could smell me, but I could certainly smell it. It reeked like the smell of rotting fish or meat, and as it opened its mouth to let out a shrieking banshee-like scream, I could see its sharp teeth. It continued to sniff around, and then it lifted one foot and simply stepped into the hole. And even as it stood in the cellar, its head was still above ground. It leaned forward on its hands in a crawling-like position and started to creep towards me, its nostrils still flaring as it searched for the source of the scent it smelled. My scent. As it grew closer, I was now sure that its eyes were fire, because they were bright enough to light up the room. It was so close to me now that I could feel the warmth of its breath on my skin, and I could taste the smell of rotting fish. Just as it locked its piercing eyes on me, I fainted. When I awoke, my mother was shaking me frantically as I was laying on the ground. When I looked up at her, she gasped with relief because she thought I was dead. I looked around and realized I was now back in my backyard, on the boundary to the forest. My clothes were torn and full of dirt, and the blood that was on my hands was now dark and dried up. My father came running out of the house and told my mother that the ambulance was on the way. I told my parents that I was fine, but they weren't backing down from this one. I was taken about 15 kilometers by ambulance to the local hospital for a prognosis that, although I got a few cuts and bruises, I was going to live. Back at home, it was time for the interrogation. My parents asked me what happened, and why I ended up unconscious in the backyard. My brother sat nervously on the couch opposite of me, because at this point, my parents didn't know about the baseball to the face, or the high-speed foot chase through the forest. I decided to leave my brother out of this one, a peace offering for the now bruise that is on his forehead that has gone unnoticed by my parents. I told them I had been playing in the backyard and that I ended up going into the woods. This alone made my father sigh underneath his breath as a sign of disapproval. I then told them that I went deeper into the woods because I wanted to go to the stream that we often visited. I then added that when I was there, I heard something that I expected to be a bear, so I took off running in the opposite direction. Then I explained to them how I ended up in a root cellar. I told them about the enormous creature that I had seen and the last thing I remembered when fainting before it got close enough to me. My parents didn't believe this for a minute and thought that this was some elaborate lie I made up to prevent them from grounding me. They then told me to tell them the real story, and I stood my ground and told them that that was the truth and there was no elaborate lie. They still wouldn't believe me and told me I was grounded until I told them the truth. Their focus was now on my brother, who was still glued to the opposite couch. They also gave him a grounding for not watching me when he had been instructed to do so. That night, at supper, none of us said a word. We just sat there in awkward silence as we ate the lasagna my mom had made for all of us. It was my meal, and she had made it before she found me unconscious in the backyard. I knew if she knew I was going to be grounded today, she wouldn't have made it. Once supper was finished, I helped my mom clear the table and then insisted that I do the dishes. I felt guilty for breaking my parents' trust by going into the woods without them, but I knew what I had seen in the woods earlier. I could still smell it, like its scent was permanently burned into my nostrils. That night, I can remember having nightmares about the creature chasing me. I woke up and my blankets were covered in sweat, and I found myself gasping for air. I turned over and looked at my alarm clock, and it was only 3 a.m. I got up from my bed and walked towards my room window. The moon was full tonight, and the light was shining through the window, lighting up my room. I stared out towards the woods and found myself wondering about the creature, wondering where it was and why it didn't eat me. Then I started to wonder how I got back to my yard, and part of me knew it had something to do with the monster. The next morning, my parents had already gone for the day. It was Friday, and we had the day off from school due to teacher conferences. My brother was left in charge, but my parents threatened that we were on a short leash. They told us that if anything happened today, that we had to call them right away, and under no circumstances were we to go into the forest. I, on the other hand, already knew that I was going to have to disobey this in order to get closure. I escaped the creature once, so I was certain I would do it again, right? After breakfast, I loaded up my knapsack with some snacks and a pocket knife my father had given me for my birthday. It was small, but sharp. I had no idea what I would do with it, because it was too small to defend myself against that giant. Curiosity had gotten the best of me, and I needed to find out what it was, and why it spared me. I tied the shoelaces on my hiking boots, and slipped out the back door, while my brother was in the washroom. I knew that if he had seen me, he would have stopped me. I would apologize for sneaking out once I got back. Or if I got back. I was at the boundary once again, and about to disobey my parents. I felt rebellious and brave for a kid. I was never like this before, and it was out of character for me. But I guess there comes a time in life when we need to be brave. I made my way into the depths of the woods again, trying to retrace my steps back to the root cellar. I listened for the sound of the stream that I knew was nearby, and when I finally found it, I discovered the path the creature had made the previous day through the trees. I could see several branches crumpled to the ground. I followed the path for a good 5 minutes when I finally found the cellar. Around the area, I could see footprints the creature had made, and they were unlike anything I had ever seen before. I knew that I needed to bring my parents out here to show them the markings, because only then will they believe me. To the side of the cellar, I could see another path leading deeper into the woods. I felt like I needed to follow it, in hopes that it would lead me to answers I so desperately wanted. I followed them slowly, ensuring to remain as quiet as possible in hopes that the creature wouldn't hear me coming. I spent a good while walking until I made it to a group of cliffs that my father called Dead Man's Rock. There, at the base of the cliff, was a divide that I had seen many times before as a kid, but never dared to adventure near. My father told me that bears used to use it as a den many years ago to birth their cubs, but abandoned it when houses started to develop closer to the forest. Like the forest, my father also told me never to go near it because it was dangerous, and God only knows what lives inside. I stood at the entrance to the den, contemplating on going in, but before I could make up my mind, I was interrupted by the sight of two glowing eyes emerging from its darkness. I stood nervously as the eyes got closer and closer, and then as they emerged from the den, I was both scared and let down. I was let down because it wasn't the creature I had been searching for, and I was scared because the eyes belonged to a timber wolf. I stood there, frozen in place, remembering what my father had taught me about wolves. I started to back away slowly. I had to maintain eye contact, so I couldn't look behind me to see where I was stepping. I knew I couldn't turn my back to the wolf, or it would think that it had the advantage and attack. The wolf started to growl at me, showing its sharp fangs. I continued to back away slowly, but the wolf was growing more agitated by the second. I knew this was going to end badly for me. I took a few more steps as the wolf prepared to lunge at me, but before it could, I backed into something. I could tell that it wasn't a tree. Then the smell from the previous day started to burn my nose. I looked up, and towering over me was the creature. My heart sank as I found myself trapped between two predators who could kill me without a doubt. Then the next thing I knew, the creature swung its razor-like hands, only it wasn't at me. It was at the wolf, killing it instantly in its tracks. I didn't know how to react at first, and figured that it was going to swing its hands once more, but this time killing me. I closed my eyes shut, thinking these were my final moments. My parents wouldn't have a body to mourn. Instead, they would always wonder what happened to me. I could feel it move on, passing me, and when I opened my eyes, I saw it hovering over the wolf, poking it to make sure it was dead. It then picked it up with its hands and started to feed on it. The creature ripped up the wolf clean in half, effortlessly. It then raised open half its mouth and devoured it. Then it pushed the other half towards me, as if it wanted me to eat it. I shook my head and said no. The creature looked at me and scrunched up its face and grunted as if I offended it. Once again, it gestured for me to take half of the wolf. I once again refused. With that, the creature tossed half of the body on the ground right at my feet. The creature finally accepted the fact that I wasn't going to eat the meal and reached down to retrieve the half. Then, with another quick movement of its hands, it raised the second half of the wolf to its mouth and devoured that as well, bones and all. I stood there, taking this all in, wondering what would happen next. I was convinced that the creature wouldn't eat me like it did the wolf. It offered me food, which was a good sign. I tried my best to communicate with it, but it was so pointless. It couldn't speak, even though it seemed like it understood what I was saying. I asked it what it was, with no response. I asked a few other questions, but I didn't get any reaction until I asked if there were others like it. A look of panic went across its face as it started to look around our surroundings, and with that, the creature picked me up by the collar of my shirt like a mother dog picking up her pup and started to run through the forest. I didn't know what was happening or why this sparked such a reaction from it. But this leads me to believe that there were others, but I wasn't sure if they were like this one. As we made our way through the forest, with me swinging helplessly from its grasp, I wasn't sure where we were going. We finally arrived at the opening to an old mine shaft that had been closed down long before I was born. Many miners would go missing down there and never be seen again. My parents told me that the locals would say they used to get disoriented and get lost in the shafts. We stood there at the entrance. Then the creature lifted its hands and pointed towards the opening. It raised its hands to its ears to tell me to listen. As we stood there in silence, I could hear noises coming from underground, and then it dawned on me. The locals didn't get lost down there. I don't know how, after all the time I've spent in the forest, I hadn't crossed paths with them before. The creature looked down at me, frantically, trying desperately to tell me something. It struggled, but it somehow managed to slur 2 words. They weren't perfect, but I knew what it meant. 2 simple words, but they made a lasting impact.
Stay away.
I knew that it was telling me that it wasn't safe here. There must be others like it lurking in those mines. Then I started to think about the wolf, and how easy the creature could rip it apart, and how it could have been me. And my focus turned to the creature, and I told it that I understood what it was trying to tell me. Then once again, it picked me up and started to make its way back into the forest. We started our journey back in the direction of my house, and I felt at ease for the first time today. This creature had no intention of hurting me. In fact, I think it was trying to protect me, like my father, from the dangers of the forest. As we continued to walk, I started to feel sad that I wasn't able to communicate more with the creature. I didn't have many friends, so I knew a part of it was somewhat like me. Isolated, and different than the ones we surrounded ourselves with. Darkness started to set in as we passed the root cellar once again. We were halfway to my house, but I knew that I would have some explaining to do. I was gone the entire day, and my parents were home by now. Then I started to think about my mom and how worried her and my father must be. They probably have the search and rescue out looking for me, and my face was most likely on a milk carton or 2, along with the words, missing. Suddenly, there was a noise directly behind us that made the creature change from a walking pace into a full-on sprint. As we ran through the trees with the branches cracking as we forced our way through, I knew that whatever was behind us meant trouble, and I could see the creature tense up. We ran faster and faster, but whatever was trailing us was gaining on us, and there was no way we would outrun it. The creature glanced back behind us and started to make sounds, unlike anything I've ever heard in my life. Then similar sounds could be heard behind us, and I connected the dots. It was the ones from the mine. I could see the light bleeding through the trees from my backyard. We were nearly there, but still, it seemed like a far distance left to go. Then suddenly, we came to a complete halt. The creature lowered me to the ground and turned to face the ones that were chasing us. Then I saw them both, 2 of them, standing directly behind us within a few feet. They were the same breed of creatures, but there were so many differences between them all. They were much scarier looking than the ones I now considered a friend, and they were much bigger too. The creature looked down at me and pointed towards my home. Then it turned its back on me and started to charge at the other 2. I started to run towards my house because I knew there was nothing I could do in this situation. They would have ripped me in half like a stick of gum and wouldn't have hesitated for a moment. As I ran, I could feel the forest floor below my feet rumble, and I could hear them fighting each other. For me. One wanted to protect me. The others wanted to devour me. I made it to the boundary of my backyard and collapsed to the ground, unable to run anymore. I turned over on my back, and I could see them in the distance. There were 3 sets of glowing eyes. The creature that I've come to know looked at me one last time before running deeper into the forest, with the other 2 close behind him, like my brother had chased me only a day before. I laid there, listening for any noises. I was afraid for my friend. It put its life on the line so that I could live, and I felt like it was a debt that I could never repay. As I waited to see if it was safe, I was startled by a voice from behind me. I guess you meant the creatures of the forest. It was my father. He stood there, directly behind me, and extended his hand towards me to offer me a hand up. I stood there, not knowing what to say to him. He wasn't angry. This I could tell. I just looked at him and nodded. He told me to go inside, and that my mom was worried sick about me. Before I started to move, I looked back once more towards the trees, and my father looked at me again and said, "Don't worry, he'll be fine." I didn't go back into the woods alone ever since that day. I respected my father's rule, and I never rebelled against it again. We do, however, go fishing in the stream that we used to fish in before. And one day, while we were baiting the hooks, the creature appeared across from us, on the opposite side of the stream. My father and I were alone, and he explained to me that there are boundaries in this forest that are established for our safety. If we respect it, we will be fine, but if we cross it, there will be consequences. The creature stood there for a short while, then turned and walked back the way it came from. After that day, I didn't see it again, and I have to admit the bond that we created that day was never broken. At night, I swear, if you listen closely, you can hear the calls cry out from amongst the trees that most would mistake for wind. But I know it's the creature, letting me know that it's okay. I've debated talking about this for a while. In fact, I've been sitting in a coffee shop around the corner from my house since 7 a.m. It's nearly 8 p.m. now. Let me start by saying that I'm not crazy, nor am I religious or superstitious. I'm a 34-year-old accountant who keeps to myself, except when spending time with my family. The reason I'm posting here is because I know some of you are good with researching, and I'm having no luck. Let me explain. I live alone in a 2-bedroom house. The neighborhood is calm and an overall pleasant place to live. However, the houses were built in the early 40s and have been continuously renovated throughout the years. This isn't a problem for me, generally speaking, but the age of the home sometimes creates drifts in rooms or creaky noises coming from the foundation. I moved in about 3 months ago. I had been living in some apartments in the city, but had been given a promotion and wanted to treat myself to an upgrade once my apartment lease ended. When I was looking for a new place, I did a lot of research. Being an accountant, I'm pretty conservative with my money, and wanted to make sure I got the most bang for my buck. This house was well under the average renting price for the square footage, and was an immediate move-in. I was sold. Now that I've gotten the backstory of how I ended up in this house out of the way, I can fast forward to what I started experiencing. Strange things. I say strange things because at this point, I wasn't really worried about anything. Like I said, I wasn't religious, nor did I believe in ghosts or demons or whatever you want to call them. It's not that I was totally against the idea. It just didn't seem realistic or scary to me. I was wrong. I guess where I'd say the strange things began was about a month ago. So 2 months after I'd moved into the house. I was sleeping in my room with my TV on. I usually fall asleep watching the news, when I suddenly woke up to a knock on my window. Startled, I sat up in bed and reached for the lamp. That's when I first felt it. In the far corner of my room, the darkness was somehow darker than the other parts of the room. I couldn't see anything, but for some reason, I felt as though there was someone or something else standing just out of view. You know when you can just feel another person there because of their warmth or their breath? Well, that's what it felt like. But instead of warmth, it was extremely cold. In the time of feeling the coldness in the corner of my room, I had almost forgotten what had woken me up to begin with. I turned to the lamp again, and instead of light filling the room with a tug of the chain, there was still darkness. All that filled the room was the moonlight coming through the curtainless windows. My eyes strained across the room towards my TV, and I realized that it had turned off. I know I fell asleep with it on. Maybe the power went out, and the knock I heard was the zap of the power outage. I looked back at the dark corner of the room, then rolled over and fell back asleep, unconcerned. The next week was uneventful. Lights kept going out in random parts of my house, but I wrote it off as old wiring. I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to that same thing as that first night, that same feeling coming from the darkest corner of my room, and the power still not working. So I decided to call an electrician. This is when things got worse. I had called 3 electricians, each agreeing to the job up until I gave them my address. Then they would mumble an excuse and then hang up. The 4th one reluctantly agreed and said he would be out later in the day. I took off work a little early to meet him at my house, and after about an hour of searching around, he said that nothing appeared to be wrong with the power or circuits. So I paid him some gas money and he left. Fast forward to last Friday. I had gone out to get a drink with some of my work buddies and got home about 12 a.m. The house was abnormally quiet, but I wrote it off as me coming home later than usual. I quickly got into bed and turned on the TV. A rerun of King of the Hill played on the local channel, so I let the laughter drown out the silence as I drifted to sleep. The knocks came from the window next to my bed. I hadn't completely fallen asleep yet, so I know exactly what I heard. No power zap. It was an actual knock from my window. I got up and lifted a single blade of the blinds just enough to peek outside into my backyard. It was dark, but I could see a darker shadow standing along the back fence line. As I strained my eyes to make out the figure, my TV zapped off behind me. I jumped a little with the sudden darkness that now consumed the room. As I turned around to face my bedroom, I noticed that same cold feeling radiating from the dark corner of my room. I stood, paralyzed, not from fear, but in disbelief, as an older woman emerged from the corner. She was so skinny. I could hear her bones sifting as it crept towards me. Her body hunched in an unnatural shape, and a sickening grin stretched over her cheeks, up to where her eyes should have been. In the place of her eyes are dark holes. She took one step at a time, each step pausing to move her unhinged jaw in an unnatural way, and her dark, stringy hair dropping onto the floor. She paused every time, as if to gauge what I was about to do. Suddenly, I snapped out of the trance-like state, and fear filled my body. "Stay back," I yelled towards the thing, and reached for the lamp. Light filled the room, and she vanished. Shaken, I turned back to the window and peeked outside. The shadow along the fence had taken a step closer, although I was still unable to see any details. Although I was admittedly pretty freaked out, I went back to bed and didn't think about it until the next night. For the next week, the same things would happen. Each time, both the creature in the corner and the creature outside would creep a little closer. I know it sounds crazy, but I kind of started to get used to it. I started sleeping with my lights on, and if they went out, just quickly turned my phone flashlight on and went back to sleep. Last night, however, was horribly different. I got home and, like usual, made dinner and plopped down on the couch to watch TV. After the sun had set and darkness had seeped in through my windows, I heard my office door creak open. I spun around on the couch, but nothing was there. When I stood up to go investigate, a gentle knock came from my back door. Reluctantly, I turned my head to see that the same figure in my backyard from last week was peeking into my bare windows. Its face twisted and smiling, just like the other thing in the corner of my room. However, this one was a male. His bony hand was formed into a bloody fist, and left a smear of blood on the window with each knock. Terrified, I went to retrieve my phone from the charger in my room. Just as I grabbed the phone, I saw the creature in the corner twisting its way towards me. Darkness consumed my room, and with a loud shattering of glass, it consumed my entire house. I ran to the bathroom and locked myself in. Sharp cries and scratching came from outside of the locked bathroom door as I sat in the bathtub and tried to turn my phone on. I must have fallen asleep like this because when I awoke, the sun was peeking through the small bathroom window. As I slowly opened the door, a horrible, rotting smell filled the room. I grabbed my things and ran out of my house, not even bothering to clean up the shattered glass at my back door. I'm currently sitting in the coffee shop I came to this morning. I've been trying to research my house, but everything is requiring a password to view the information. I tried calling those electricians, but my phone is saying their numbers have been disconnected. I don't know what I'm going to do, but it's dark outside, and the coffee shop closes in 30 minutes. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or demons, but I do know that it is darker in the corners at night for a reason.